4 True Scary Cemetery in Navajo Horror Stories from Reddit. What you're about to hear are stories submitted by real people on Reddit. These aren't campfire tales or made-up legends. These are accounts from people who went somewhere they probably shouldn't have and came back changed. Tonight, we're diving into 4 of the most disturbing experiences shared by people who had terrifying encounters in and around Navajo cemeteries. If you're watching this late at night, maybe keep a light on. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Man Who Stood Between the Headstones. This story comes from a Reddit user who goes by the name DuskwalkerNM. He posted it in one of the paranormal subreddits about 3 years ago, and it never left me. He says, and I quote, "I don't talk about this in real life. Nobody would believe me anyway." His name is Cody. At the time of this story, he was 23 years old, living in a small town on the edge of the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. He'd grown up there his whole life. He knew the land, the roads, the people. He thought he knew what was out there. He was wrong. It was late October, the kind of October where the air gets thin and cold and the nights feel longer than they should. Cody had been out driving with his friend Terrence. They'd been out since around 9, just riding around, talking, the way young guys in small towns do when there's nothing else going on. At some point, they ended up on a back road neither of them had traveled in years, a narrow 2-lane strip of asphalt that cut through open desert scrubland. No streetlights, no houses, just flat darkness and the pale wash of their headlights. That's when Terrence pointed out the cemetery. It sat maybe 50 yards off the road, behind a low iron fence that had gone orange with rust. There were no lights on it, no signs, just a cluster of old headstones jutting out of the cracked earth, some of them tilted, some of them so worn down you couldn't make out the names anymore. A few had handmade wooden markers instead of stone, the kind held together with wire and prayer. Cody says he'd driven past this stretch of road 100 times and never noticed it before. That alone felt strange to him. Terrence, being the kind of guy who thought fear was something to be tested, wanted to stop. He wanted to walk through it. Cody didn't. He says he felt something looking at it. Not curiosity, not excitement, just a deep, pulling dread. The kind that doesn't have a reason, the kind that lives in your gut and tells you to leave. But Terrence was already getting out of the car. Cody stayed behind. He kept the engine running. He sat there watching Terrence's silhouette disappear through the gap in the old fence, his phone flashlight cutting a thin white beam between the headstones. Cody watched from the car window. He says he kept his eyes on that light. Then he saw something else. At the far end of the cemetery, past where Terrence was walking, deep in the shadows near the back row of headstones, there was a figure, just standing there. Tall, too tall, Cody says. Not moving, not looking at Terrence, looking at the car, looking at him. Cody froze. He told himself it was another person, a caretaker maybe, someone visiting a grave late at night. He tried to make it make sense, but the figure wasn't dressed right. It wasn't wearing a jacket despite the cold. It looked like it was wearing something long and dark that hung loose off its frame, and its arms, Cody says, were reaching past where arms should reach. He honked the horn once hard. Terrence spun around, startled, and started walking back fast. The figure didn't move, not even a flinch at the sound. It just stood there, completely still, watching. Cody says he started screaming for Terrence through the cracked window. "Get back in the car, right now! Get in the car!" Terrence could hear something was wrong in his voice. He jogged back through the gap in the fence and jumped into the passenger seat. The second his door shut, Cody put the car in drive and pulled onto the road. "What's wrong?" Terrence asked. Cody pointed at the back of the cemetery. "There's someone back there, standing near the last row." Terrence turned to look through the rear window. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very slowly, "Cody, there's nothing back there." Cody looked in his rearview mirror. The figure was gone. He drove home without stopping. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed listening to every sound the wind made outside his window, telling himself it was nothing, that his eyes had played tricks on him in the dark. But here's the part that stuck with me most. Here's the part Cody added at the bottom of his post. The next morning, he went back. In daylight, the cemetery looked smaller, sadder, just a forgotten stretch of graves with no visitors and no care. He walked to the back row where the figure had been standing. He was going to prove to himself there was nothing unusual about it, just an old graveyard, just shadows and nerves. He found the back row. He walked along it slowly, reading the names on the markers that still had names. Most of the dates were old, early 1900s, some even older. But at the very last headstone in the row, the one closest to where the figure had been standing the night before, the stone was different. It was newer, not new like last year, but newer than the others, maybe 40 or 50 years old. The name on it was worn, but still readable. Cody says he stood there for a long time staring at it, because the name on that headstone was his last name. Not a relative, not someone he recognized, just his last name, sitting there in that cemetery he supposedly never known about, at the exact spot where that figure had been standing the night before, staring directly at him. He never went back. He says he never will. And whatever that thing was, standing in the dark between those headstones, he believes it knew exactly who was in that car.
Story 2. We dug up the wrong grave. This next one comes from a user named Rowan Fields, and he posted it with a warning at the top that said, "I am not proud of what we did. I'm sharing this because I think people need to understand that some places are off limits for a reason." Rowan was 19. Him and two friends, a guy named Eli and a girl named Petra, were the kind of teenagers who thought exploring abandoned and forgotten places was a hobby. They called themselves urban explorers, though what they actually were, Rowan admits now, was just reckless kids with too much time and not enough fear. They'd been doing it for 2 years by the time this happened. Old buildings, empty warehouses, condemned houses. They documented everything. Took photos, posted online, got followers. It felt like nothing could go wrong. Then someone in their comment section sent them coordinates. No message, no explanation, just a set of GPS coordinates in a private message and 3 words underneath: "You'll want this." The coordinates led them to a stretch of land deep within the Navajo Nation, an area they had no business being in, an area where outsiders weren't welcome and where the land itself held things most people don't understand. Rowan says he knew it on some level. He says his grandmother, who was part Dine, had told him his whole life that certain land was not to be disturbed, that the Navajo people understood something about death and the dead that most people had simply forgotten. He went anyway. It took them 3 hours of driving and another 20 minutes of hiking on foot through brush and dry rock before they found it. A small burial ground. No fence, no sign, just a cluster of graves in a natural clearing, surrounded by juniper trees that had grown so old their trunks had twisted into shapes that looked almost like hands reaching out of the ground. Rowan says the second they stepped into the clearing, Petra stopped walking. She grabbed his arm. "Something's wrong here," she said. "I don't feel right." Eli laughed it off. He was already taking pictures, already moving between the graves, crouching down, reading the markers. Rowan stood near the edge of the clearing, watching. He says the air felt different inside the clearing, heavier, like the pressure had changed, like being underwater. Eli called them over to one grave in particular. It was set apart from the others, slightly away from the main cluster, positioned near the base of the largest juniper tree. The marker was a flat stone with carvings on it, not letters, but symbols, shapes Rowan couldn't read. "I bet there's something in here," Eli said. And before either of them could say anything, before Rowan could even process what was happening, Eli had pulled out the small folding shovel he always kept in his pack for urban exploration and pushed it into the earth. "Stop," Rowan said, but Eli was already digging. He only got about 8 inches down before the smell hit them. Rowan says he can't describe it properly. He says it wasn't just decay. It was something underneath the decay, something older and deeper, like rot and copper and something else he had no name for. All three of them stepped back. Petra made a sound in her throat and turned away. The hole Eli had dug was small, barely the size of a shoebox opening, but something was visible inside. Not remains, or at least not what Rowan expected. It looked like cloth. Dark, tightly wrapped cloth, bound with what looked like leather cord. And it was moving. Not violently, not dramatically, just a slow, rhythmic pressing against the cloth, like something breathing inside it. Eli dropped his shovel and stumbled back so fast he fell. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, for what Rowan says felt like a full minute. Then the sound started. Low, resonant, not an animal sound, and not quite a human sound. Rowan describes it as something vibrating deep under the earth, like a voice being filtered through rock and soil. Not words, not a language he recognized, just a single extended tone that rose and fell and rose again. "Fill it back in," Petra whispered. She was crying. "Fill it back in right now." Eli grabbed the shovel with shaking hands and pushed the loose dirt back into the hole. He packed it down, hard, frantically. The sound didn't stop the whole time he was doing it. It just kept resonating up through the ground, through their feet, up into their chests. The moment the hole was filled and the earth was packed back down, it stopped. Complete silence. They ran, all three of them, back through the brush, back to the car, drove 90 miles before anyone said a word. Here's what Rowan shared at the end of his post. It's the part that has stayed with me since the first time I read it. For the next 3 weeks, all three of them experienced the same thing, not together, separately, in their own homes, in their own beds. At some point in the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, they would each wake up suddenly, completely alert, and in the corner of their room, in the darkest part of the shadow where the light quite didn't reach, there would be a shape, just standing, never moving, never making a sound, just present, watching. By the 4th week, for 2 of them, it stopped. Rowan says it never stopped for him. He says to this day, 3 years later, he still wakes up at 2 in the morning. He still looks at the corner of his room. And sometimes the shadow is still there.
Story 3. The Girl at the Edge of the Cemetery Road. I want to be careful with how I describe this one, because the person who submitted it, a woman named Dolores, wrote it very carefully, like she'd been thinking about how to word it for a long time before she finally decided to put it online. She was in her mid-30s when this happened. A nurse. She drove a long commute, nearly 45 minutes each way between the hospital where she worked and the small home she rented outside the reservation. She drove that road hundreds of times. She knew every curve of it. One night, coming home after a double shift, it was close to 2:30 in the morning. The road was completely empty, the way it always is out there at that hour. Flat desert on both sides, the occasional Joshua tree catching her headlights for a second before falling back into dark. She had the radio on low. She was tired, but alert. About 15 minutes from home, her headlights swept around the long curve and caught something on the right side of the road. A girl, standing at the shoulder, facing away from traffic. Dolores slowed down immediately. The girl looked young, maybe 12 or 13, Dolores thought. She was small, wearing what looked like a light dress that was completely wrong for the temperature outside. It was cold that night, probably 40 degrees. The girl had no jacket, no bag, nothing, just standing there at the edge of the road, very still, facing the darkness on the other side of the fence. Dolores pulled over a little past her and put on her hazard lights. As a nurse, her instinct was immediate. This child was in danger. Alone on a desert highway at 2 in the morning, something was very wrong. She got out of her car. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl didn't move. Dolores walked toward her slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Honey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" She was about 10 feet away when she realized what she was looking at on the other side of the fence. A cemetery. A small one, barely visible in the darkness, just rows of headstones catching a sliver of moonlight. And she noticed something else. There was no gate, no break in the fence near where the girl was standing, no obvious way the girl could have come from inside the fence, and no reason to be standing in front of it on a road with no homes nearby. "Sweetie, where do you live? Can you tell me your name?" The girl turned around. Dolores says she can't fully describe what she saw. She says the girl's face was normal. 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. Nothing grotesque, nothing monstrous. But something was wrong with it in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to the part of the brain that handles fear. Something in the proportion of the features. Something in the way the eyes caught the light. Too flat, she says. Like the reflection you get off an animal's eyes in the dark. Like the light was going in, but not coming back out the right way. The girl looked at her and said nothing. Then she smiled. Dolores says the smile was what broke her. She cannot explain why. She just says it was the wrongest thing she had ever seen on a human face, and some deep prehistoric part of her brain sent one signal, and one signal only: run. She backed up fast, got into her car, locked the doors, and pulled back onto the road. In her rearview mirror, she could see the girl still standing there, still facing her direction, watching the car drive away. Dolores drove home shaking so hard she could barely hold the wheel. She called her sister from the driveway and talked for an hour before she could bring herself to go inside. The next morning, she drove back to that stretch of road. In daylight, it looked ordinary, empty, just the shoulder, the fence, the cemetery beyond it. She stopped and got out. She walked to the spot where the girl had been standing. There were footprints in the soft dirt at the road's edge, small ones, bare feet, no shoes. They came from the direction of the cemetery fence, but the fence was intact, no gap, no hole, no way through. The footprints didn't lead away from the fence, they led towards it. They stopped at the base of the fence post, as if whoever made them had simply walked up to the fence and then ceased to exist on the other side of it. Dolores has driven that road nearly every night since. She says she has never seen the girl again, but she says she never drives past that cemetery without feeling like she's being watched from the darkness beyond the headstones. And every now and then, late at night, she catches herself looking in the rearview mirror for no reason at all. Just checking.
The last story tonight is the one that unsettled me the most out of everything I've read this month. It comes from a Reddit user named Trail Dust Writer, and honestly, the way he writes it, you can feel the weight of it. You can feel how long he sat with this before he finally decided to type it out and share it with strangers on the internet. He prefaced the whole post with just one line: "I'm sharing this for my uncle because he deserved to be heard." That line alone told me this one was different. He's writing about his uncle, a man he calls Virgil, who was in his early 60s at the time this happened. Virgil was a Navajo man, born and raised on the land where his family had lived for generations. He wasn't someone who dramatized things. He wasn't someone who talked much at all, really. He had spent his whole life doing physical work: ranch hand, fence builder, groundskeeper, general maintenance. Quiet, steady, practical work that kept his hands busy and his words few. Trail Dust Writer describes him as the kind of man who fixed problems instead of talking about them. The kind of man who looked at the land around him with deep respect, but no superstition, or so the family always thought. He was not someone who scared easily. His nephew makes that very clear. He was not the type to exaggerate or seek attention. He had no history of anxiety, no health conditions that might explain what happened. He was simply a man who went to work one morning and came home carrying something he couldn't put down. Which is exactly why, when Virgil sat his family down that evening and told him what had happened, every single one of them believed him without question. Virgil had taken a contract job doing maintenance work on a small, old cemetery, one of the many scattered across and around the Navajo Nation that hold the remains of people who lived, worked, and died on that land going back generations. Some of these cemeteries are well kept. Some have been partially forgotten by everyone except the earth itself. This one sat somewhere in between. It still had visitors occasionally, still had markers that people cared about, but the edges had gone wild. The brush had crept in thick along the fence line, and the ground in certain spots had shifted and settled in ways that needed correcting. Virgil's job was straightforward: clear the overgrowth along the perimeter, repack and level the soil where erosion had disturbed the surface near the older graves, make note of any headstones that had cracked, sunk, or fallen over so that proper repairs could be arranged. He had done this kind of work at other sites before. He understood what it meant to be in a place like that. He moved carefully, quietly, with the kind of respect that doesn't need to be instructed. It just lives inside a person. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. The sky was pale and clear. The air was cold and still in that way the desert gets in early autumn, when the heat of summer has finally pulled back and the mornings carry a sharpness to them. He parked his truck on the gravel access road just outside the gate, gathered his tools, and let himself in through the iron latch entrance. He worked along the south and west sides first, moving steadily, not rushing. The work was physical, but peaceful. Just the sound of his hand tool against dry brush, the occasional crunch of gravel under his boots, and the low hum of silence that deep, quiet places always seem to carry. No wind, no birds. Even the insects seemed to be holding still that morning. By mid-morning he had made his way to the far eastern edge of the cemetery, the section where the brush had grown in thickest, climbing up along the inside of the fence in dense, dry clusters that had gone untouched for probably 2 or 3 seasons. He knelt down in the dirt and began working through it methodically, cutting back the dead growth and pulling it away from the fence posts in chunks. The soil out here was looser than the rest of the grounds, softer, almost like the earth was thinner here somehow. He had been at it for maybe 20 minutes when he stopped. He stopped because he heard something. It was coming from the ground, not from nearby, not from somewhere across the cemetery, not from outside the fence, not from down the road. It was coming from directly beneath him, from just inches below the surface of the soil his knees were pressed against. A voice. An old man's voice, low and slow, speaking in Navajo, but not in any dialect Virgil could fully place. According to his nephew, Virgil said it was like hearing a version of his own language that was several generations older, the way certain words used to be shaped before they shifted over time. He couldn't follow the meaning, but he recognized the music of it, the rise and fall of syllables, the particular rhythm that prayer carries in any language, when the words have been said so many times they've worn smooth. Virgil went completely still. He didn't pull back. He didn't stand up. He just knelt there in the dirt and listened, barely breathing. The voice did not stop. It kept going, steady, unhurried, rhythmic, like something being recited from deep memory, like something that didn't need an audience to continue. And as Virgil stayed there frozen, he became aware that the voice beneath him wasn't alone. There were others. Not surrounding him, not in front of him or behind him, below him, at different depths, one under another, the way floors stack in a building, each voice distinct, each one speaking in that same ancient cadence, some overlapping, some separate, none of them reacting to each other, just existing alongside each other in the dark under the earth, all of them going at once like they had been going for a very long time. Virgil stood up slowly. He took one step back, then another. He began walking towards the center of the cemetery, away from the fence line, and the voices shifted under him, not following him exactly, not chasing him, just always there, always directly underfoot, no matter where he moved within the boundary of that property. Every step he took, they were beneath it. The whole ground was speaking. He walked to the gate without running. He made himself walk. He unlatched it, stepped out onto the gravel road outside the fence, and stopped.
Total silence, immediate and absolute, the way a television cuts off when the power goes. The moment both his feet were on that gravel outside the fence line, nothing, not a whisper, not a vibration, as if the boundary of the cemetery was also the boundary of whatever was happening inside it. Virgil stood on that gravel road for a long time, staring back through the gate at the quiet rows of headstones. His tools were still on the ground, inside, near the eastern fence where he'd left them. He went back in, retrieved them quickly, and left without looking down. He drove home. He called the historical site and told them he had completed his work for the day. He didn't explain anything further. He just went home, sat at the kitchen table, and waited for his family to gather, because he knew he needed to say this out loud to people who would understand it. He told them everything, every detail, in order, without flinching. His nephew says he never raised his voice, never seemed frightened in the way fear usually looks on a person. He just reported it, the way a man describes a strange weather pattern he witnessed. Factual, careful, like he wanted to make sure he got it exactly right. When he was done, he sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at the table and said the thing that has stayed with Trail Dust Rider ever since. They weren't in pain. That's what I keep thinking about. Whatever they were saying down there, they weren't suffering. They were busy, like they had somewhere to be. Like whatever comes after this life, they were still in the middle of it. He paused, long enough that no one spoke. That's what scares me. Not that they were hurting, but that they were still going. Like death wasn't the end of anything. Like it was just a door they walked through, and on the other side, they just kept on, kept talking, kept moving, like nothing stopped. Nobody at the table said anything about that for a long time after that. Virgil passed away 2 years later, natural causes. He was 68 years old, and he went quietly, the same way he had lived. His family gathered at the graveside on a cold, clear afternoon to lay him down in land that knew his family for a long time. His nephew, Trail Dust Rider, was standing at the edge of the grave when he felt it. Not a sound, not exactly, more like a pressure rising through the soles of his shoes, a deep, low vibration coming from somewhere far below the surface of soil and stone and time. Not loud, not frightening, just present, just there. He didn't say anything to anyone standing beside him. He just stood there with his hands folded and his eyes down, and he listened. He says he still isn't sure, even now, whether what he felt that day was something to be afraid of. He says it didn't feel like a warning. He says, and this is the part I can't stop thinking about, it almost felt like a welcome. Those were 4 stories shared by real people, experiences that happened in places most of us will never go, in land that holds history and memory and things we don't fully understand. If there's one thing I've taken from stories like these, it's something Virgil said that can't shake, that dying might just be a door. I don't know what's on the other side of it, but if these stories are any indication, whatever's there, it knows.